Welcome to our webinar, 5 Lessons for Shifting the Narrative on Migrants in the Border Region. I'm Janelle Tribitz, Creative Engagement Coordinator at the Opportunity Agenda, and I'll be moderating today's webinar. The Opportunity Agenda is a social justice communication lab. We work with partners to move hearts and minds toward lasting policy and culture change. Today, we'll discuss the potential for both advocates and artists to shift the narrative on migrants in the border region, looking at the new opportunities to persuade and inspire that are emerging even as fear-mongering and white nationalism intensify. We're joined this afternoon by 3 speakers who I'd like to thank for their time. They are Julie Fisher-Rowe, our Director of Training, Narrative, and Journalism here at the Opportunity Agenda. Itzel Guillen, the Immigration Integration Manager at Alliance San Diego, and Sonia Guiñansaca, the Managing Director at CultureStrike. We'll be taking questions during a live Q&A at the end of the webinar, so feel free to enter any questions you have into the questions function on your GoToWebinar toolbar. You can enter your questions at any time during the webinar. You can join the conversation online as well by using the hashtag #FutureOverFear or by tweeting @OpAgenda. That's @OPPAGENDA. After the webinar, a short evaluation will pop up on your screen. Please take the time to fill that out so we can improve future webinars based on your feedback. Sorry, I'm just double checking that it looks like everybody is joining all right. And in one more moment, I'm going to ask Julie to get started. Okay, great. Thank you so much for your patience. Our first speaker will be Julie Fisher-Rowe, and she's going to be sharing 5 lessons for shifting the narrative on migrants in the border region. Welcome, Julie. Take it away.
Great. Thanks, Janelle. Hi, everyone. So today we are going to be talking about some of the, just 5 of the ideas that we have come up with over our work working with folks in the border region to really shift this long-term narrative about the region. We see it, in the headlines all the time, especially with the fixation on the wall and everything that has caused recently. And we really want to find ways to help folks also talk about this long-term narrative, this long-term vision of what the border region should actually look like, because we believe that the care and feeding of that will actually help in a lot of these short-term fights, because people's misconceptions and fears and manufactured fears about the region and about the line in the sand, if you will, are causing a lot of problems for all of us, but particularly for the folks who both live in the region and those who are trying to cross through into the country. So the first one, unsurprisingly, is to talk about that long-term vision and the solutions that we need for the region. And folks in the region are doing a very good job of this. I think that a lot of us who aren't living directly there need to help them and be supportive in this work of talking about what the border region really is like, what the communities that live there experience, and what the area looks like, what the environment is like there, to really just give a full picture instead of people just seeing a fence or a wall. And it's really important to have imagery that helps with that talks about this realistic vision of the border, but also what the long-term needs are, which are what every community needs: infrastructure and investment, and not militarization, drones, and barbed wire, and all of those things. And, artists can be really helpful in this because they can really help the future feel both tangible and possible. We know that even for folks who have been working on this for a long time, we tend to focus on the problem more, and artists can be really helpful in showing what a solution can look like and creating unifying symbols and imagery and stories that really explore our shared values and that show the solutions that we need and celebrate the vision that we're all trying to put forward. So we're really, hoping that everyone can just think big a little bit before we get into all of the weeds of the conversations that are happening now. Think, what is the picture that I want to paint, so that my audiences are feeling that and seeing that first, and then they'll understand a little bit more why this talk of militarization clashes with what communities really need. So the next tip is to really humanize discussion. as I've hinted at, there is a vision that comes up when we're talking about the region, and that is of a wall in the middle of the desert with little human activity around it, except for those crossing through and those trying to stop them, right? And so we know that there are full communities who live there who are experiencing the fallout of this ginned up fear of people crossing. And there's real consequences to that. And there's also communities who have lived binationally for generations, who have a shared history and a shared culture. And it's as we'll hear later from both Itzel and Sonia, it's disruptive and heartbreaking to have these barriers go through their communities. But people audiences that are less familiar need to see this. They need to really see the communities who are there. And so talking about people is just really important. Talking about border communities, borderlands, referencing more than just the border, because the border brings up the wall. And we don't want to be talking about that. We want to be talking about the people who are all around it. And so some other ways to do this are to talk about human stories, but also to talk about things like food and culture and sports teams and things that all communities enjoy about themselves and their histories and their traditions. And then it's important also thinking when we're talking about human stories to be try to tell them in fulsome ways. So some of the storytelling that we see used on the other side really brings immigrants, for instance, boils them down to just the characteristic of crossing the border and doesn't really fully give them a bigger story. And it's important that when audiences are viewing people, that they view people in their whole spirit, right? So if we can talk about that these are families that are crossing, mothers, workers, students, artists, people who have visions and dreams and all of those things, to make sure that we're not just boiling it down to migrants crossing a line, because that's the story we're hearing. And the simple solution to that is fortify the line. And that's not the solution any of us want. So we have to tell the story in order to get to the solution that we want. The third is we really need to center the voices of the community, of the folks who are there, whose voices are left out of this a lot out of these conversations. So that means for the rest of us who aren't necessarily within 100 miles of the border region, to center folks on social media, to partner with folks who are there, to see the language that they are using, to bring them into discussions, to partner with artists who are working on the region. There's examples of people bringing in Mobilize the Immigrant Vote, for instance, created an artist in residence position and partnered with CultureStrike, which is a migrant-led group, and which Sonia is the managing director, who will be speaking later. If you have influence, share your platform and industry access with frontline voices and artists. For instance, W. Kamau Bell went to the border to share perspectives of people who are down there for his show on CNN. So these are examples of how you can bring people in, but making sure that we're not just talking about it from afar. It's important, again, for audiences who aren't familiar to see that there are people at the border, but also know their perspective and understand that they have been overlooked and pushed to the side in favor of these not helpful political conversations. So, and number 4 is a little bit different, because this is really when we are talking about some of the fallout that has happened because of the conversations about the border itself. So if you're talking about the border region, I think stick to the long-term vision, the centering the voices, the humanizing the discussion. When we're talking about the shutdown and the wall and all of that, it's best if you can to push aside the border region for a moment, and because that is not the real cause of this. The real cause of this is politics and manufactured fear. We need to lay the blame where the blame is supposed to go, because not be saying we don't need a wall, we don't need this, don't need that. Say what we do need. We need politicians to take responsibility. We need them to do this in a responsible way that pays attention to human needs and rights and our values. So when talking about things like the shutdown and the wall, I think it's best to really focus in on where the responsibility lies, and then talk about the border region separately and the needs that they have separately as much as you can. I know it's all mixed up into one, but we want audiences' heads to be clear about who is responsible for this. And it's not people living in the border region, and it's not people crossing, it's politicians who are making things up in order to try to distract and divide us. And finally, this goes along a little bit with the last one, but this is to tell your own story and not be repeating the opposition narrative, which is out there and very strong. And the more we repeat it, the more we feed it, the more we give it strength. And so often one of the formats that we see is something we call myth busting, which is when you actually list out the myths that the other side is saying and then refute them one by one. And we know from a variety of research and experience that this really only serves to reinforce and strengthen the myths themselves. You put them in people's heads, you've talked about them more, you've talked about the language, you've strengthened the language. So instead, carefully consider the stories that we're telling and decide what we want to leave in the story and what we want to leave out of the story. And this, means definitely thinking about the language that the other side is using, but also thinking about the imagery that we use. So if you're saying, like, we don't need a wall, and you're just showing pictures of walls everywhere, that is getting into people's heads, and pretty soon what they're thinking of is border equals wall. And so what we want to do instead is do, all the other steps that I talked about, which is, showing the communities, showing people, and then, but then very carefully considering to leave out as well. One of the ways that we saw this being important is when people were talking about the groups of folks coming up from South America to come along the border and seek asylum. And there was a lot of talk about the word caravan, and there was a lot of talk about what people were fleeing, violence and poverty and terrorism, things like that. Our recommendation is talk about what people are coming towards, talk about what we have in common, talk about what those folks need and what we as a country need to provide, because that's the kind of country we are. Talk about what we want in the story, not what we don't want in the story. So those are just 5 tips. Obviously, there's a lot more. And Sonia and Itzel have some great experiences they're going to share with you about how they've been working on these issues and in the region. But please feel free to ask questions and definitely visit our website for more language samples and other ideas about how to talk about this region. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Julie. I just forgot to take myself off mute there for a second. So now I'm going to turn things over to Itzel Guillen Maganda. Itzel was born in Mexico City and came to the United States at the age of 5. She is one of the beneficiaries of Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, DACA, which allows her to work and be protected from deportation in the United States. As Alliance San Diego's Immigrant Integration Manager, Itzel has been organizing and coordinating educational forums and services for the immigrant community in San Diego. So San Diego shares a border with Tijuana, Mexico, and along with other cities in the border region, it would bear the brunt of the border security measures now being debated in Congress. So Itzel, would you share your perspective on the border region and the impact this border security funding would have?
Yes, of course. Good morning, everyone, or good afternoon, depending on where you are. Thank you all for having me on this webinar. And, to answer your question about my perspective on what the border region is, well, I'd first like to talk about a little bit about myself and how I got here. So like you said, I was born in Mexico City, and I've lived in the border region for nearly 20 years. I call myself a fronteriza, a border resident. This is my everyday reality, living in the border region. And although I have experienced fear, everyday anxiety of losing my family to Border Patrol, I've also met the most loving and welcoming people that I've ever met in this region as well. And this picture is painted of this desert land, and that's just not what it is. We have families that work here. Children go to school every day. They play at parks. If you don't mind going to the next slide, I'd like to talk a little bit about the picture of the little boy, right? People enjoying the beach that is separated by an existing fence that cuts through the Pacific Ocean. This is our everyday life. That shopping center that you see is the wall is literally right behind it. And families go here all the time, to shop, and they come from all over the world. The San Isidro Port of Entry, it is one of the busiest land border crossings in the world. Every day, it welcomes people from all over the world to our city of San Diego. And our county, it's home to over 3 million people, but all of us are subject to the 100-mile zone. So I know that Julie mentioned it earlier, right? But what this means is that we have border agents operating in our communities all the time. They're in that same shopping center that's in that picture. That's called Plaza Las Americas, near colleges. One of the colleges that we work really closely with, it's in the border region. We have students telling us that they fear crossing that border now because of all of the heightened militarization that's been happening lately. And, these are US citizen children or residents, and they just fear being able to come back into the country that they know. Another fact is whenever we leave our county, we have to be subject to Border Patrol inspection, regardless of which direction we go to. So if, for example, we're trying to go to Disneyland here in our northern part of California and LA, we have to cross a border checkpoint. And that's something that's not really talked about, right? The border is more than a line in the sand. That's 100 miles, and that includes our entire county. So that means border agents are in our entire county, disrupting the lives of everyday people. But San Diego and Tijuana, we're sister cities like Calexico, Mexicali, El Paso, and Juarez. We really have a heart that beats for us both. And, shutting down the border, as what happened recently in November, it created really negative impacts for our county. The border cities of San Diego and Tijuana, like I said, we have a shared culture, a legacy of welcoming people from all over the world. Our binational region is one of hope and opportunity that reflects our shared values, which are compassion, dignity, and respect for all human beings. When the border was shut down during Thanksgiving weekend, it had a real negative impact on commerce. And I'll share a quote from the San Isidro Chamber of Commerce. Shop owners alone lost an estimated $5.3 million in sales, and 75% of local businesses decided to close that Sunday during the 5-hour shutdown. And that was huge. That's the weekend of Black Friday, right? When a lot of businesses are open and offering their services to people from all over the world. And in addition to that critical impact of shutting down the border, that what it had on commerce, any future shutdowns will have irreversible damage on San Diego's labor force, tourism, and our commercial commerce. With that being said, the conversation that is continuing in Congress about whether or not to increase border security, I really hope that the Trump administration has learned a valuable lesson, that he cannot take dreamers, asylum seekers, border communities, and working families hostage for harmful campaign promises that the majority of the people oppose. This was a tantrum that was thrown, and it really held federal workers and families in our communities hostage. We don't need additional border security. What we need instead is real infrastructure solutions, those that reduce waiting periods for border crossers that have to cross that line every day. We need to invest instead in accountability, transparency for an agency that has operated in an environment of abuse and human rights violations for so long. And I'll just touch a little bit about myself again. I am a border dreamer, and our lives are being used as bargaining chips nearly weekly in exchange for that wall. And in my perspective, and many border dreamers share this perspective, is we will not be used now or ever to damage further our communities. We don't want to have band-aid solutions like DACA. What we need from Congress is legislation that will protect us, but not at the expense of our families and our communities. So during the next few weeks, we know that the Trump administration is going to be talking about the wall again and who they're going to be using hostage. We don't know. It could be dreamers again. But it really is our responsibility to make sure that Congress doesn't give in and that they don't trade in our communities, because there are real people, real lives that will suffer the damage.
And can you tell us a little bit about what Alliance San Diego is working toward, the kinds of solutions that you all are putting forward and working on in your day-to-day work?
Of course. So through our immigrant integration work, we're really hoping to, we're working to empower students and youth to become civically engaged for 2020. So we're offering free immigration services through community colleges to find out how many people we could help move to more permanent forms of immigration relief. whether that be U.S. citizenship for eligible legal permanent residents, right, or moving DACA recipients to more permanent solutions. We're working on that every day, and while we're doing that, we're also changing the narrative. We're continuing to change the narrative about what border communities look like, and we're doing that by uplifting the voices of those of us that live in this region. And I think this is a wonderful opportunity to continue to work that as well. Through the Southern Border Communities Coalition, which we are a part of, we're continuing to work towards 3 goals, and that is to ensure that border enforcement policies and practices are accountable, fair, and respect human dignity and human rights and prevent the loss of life in the region. 2, we're promoting policies and solutions that improve the quality of life in border communities. And last, we're supporting rational and humane immigration reform policies affecting the border region. I would really like to invite you all to follow southernborder.org through the borderlines to get the most updated information about what is happening in our communities here in the borderlands.
And my last question for you, Itzel, so there are a lot of folks on this call, both advocates and artists, who work on immigration, but who may not live in the border region or have such an intimate connection to the folks who live on the border region. So how can we all support the effort to change how people think and talk about the border region?
Yeah, well, I think this call, and again, thank you to the Opportunity Agenda for offering this opportunity, is a lot about what we can do for those of us that are not living in the border region, and that's to help us shape and change the narrative about what border communities look like, what they really are. It's about listening to the stories from the border, from border residents, and sharing those same stories. Last week, we had our All People Celebration breakfast, and we had Grisa Martinez Rosas be our keynote speaker. And she really said something that has touched me, and I'm going to take that moving forward with my work, but that is to allow those closest to the pain to lead the work. And I think that is super important by allowing us to even have this conversation about what it means like to be undocumented in the border region. That's huge, right? So I think that's something that we could all continue to do, and to uplift the stories, the real stories of border residents and what it means to be from the border region, what it means to be binational, and what it means to, instead of militarizing, revitalizing our communities.
Thank you so much, Itzel. Now I'd like to introduce Sonia Guiñansaca. Sonia is an internationally acclaimed queer migrant poet, cultural organizer, and activist from Harlem. They co-founded and helped build some of the largest undocumented organizations in the country, coordinating and participating in groundbreaking civil disobedience actions in the immigrants' rights movement. They also founded some of the first creative artistic projects by and for undocumented writers and artists. Currently, Sonia is leading cultural equity work as a managing director at CultureStrike. Hi, Sonia. As a national arts organization led by migrant artists, CultureStrike is doing incredibly innovative and intersectional cultural work. Would you share how CultureStrike centers frontline's voices and how your work tries to change and expand the narratives around immigrants and immigration?
For sure. Thank you so much, Janelle. And it's such a pleasure to be on this call and seeing, and not actually seeing everyone, but hearing just Itzel just sharing like the important need to be like centering also like organizers and like the amazing work that many movement immigrant organizations are doing. And so actually I wanted to start off by sharing a quote by Jeff Chang, where he says that every moment of major social change requires a collective leap of imagination. Political transformation must be accompanied not just by spontaneous and organized expressions of unrest and risk, but by an explosion of mass creativity. And I think for us at CultureStrike, we know that culture is not neutral. It is a battleground. Culture is dynamic. It is ever evolving constructs in which we live our lives. Culture drives economics and drives politics. And one of the things that we've noticed is that narrative framing and a lot of the narrative framing around immigration has been driven by folks who are not embodied in the experience of being undocumented or being migrant or living in border towns or understanding the complexities and the intersections of being migrant and having to deal with immigration. And so what we believe injustice and liberation is that as much ability to impact culture and correspondence to social behaviors it's that we need to really be intentional about how we're organizing with artists. And so some of the work at CultureStrike, that what we're doing is to really envision and push the imagination around when we're talking about migration, when we're talking about borders, when we're talking about the impact that artists and cultural workers can do. And so wanted us to go to the next slide, if possible. So we had this amazing opportunity to work with the Opportunity Agenda, to work on this project called Border Visions. And I think for me, it's really crucial to uplift the collaboration of two major national organizations to come together and really see how we can organize and really bring to the border, to El Paso, artists, cultural workers, funders, movement organizations, organizers, activists who are maybe not from the region to really comprehend what is happening and to witness. One of the things we also try to do with Border Vision is to immerse folks in the art that is being done. So not just coming from a framework of reactionary or from a framework that that really minimizes the tremendous culture and the tremendous work that is being done at the border of celebration. So this Border Vision was really, I think for us, one of the projects that really exemplified the strategies that we at CultureStrike are trying to do, which is like really shift the narratives, really put the resources and bring up the necessity of inclusion of artists and cultural workers when we're trying to imagine what does a world look like without borders, what does a world look like without prisons, without detention centers. And it was impactful in the way that, again, I can emphasize how tremendous it was to work with the Opportunity Agenda to make this dream, this space come true, and to be also in the company of many organizers who are from the border region, because they are bringing that experience, that embodied, just lived experience of being there. Next slide, please. One of the things that we also try to do, and the things that I wanted to bring up is that at CultureStrike for this year, for 2019, we're trying to activate artists and storytellers and envisioning justice, collaborating with social movements, and creating venues for the stories to disrupt. We're also hoping to incubate artist leaders with their projects and their ideas, and we're also organizing artists to build power and transform the cultural landscapes to be more equitable. So if we have more artists and we have more cultural workers, then we're able to also have more narratives that are disrupting, but also placing us in a place of hope and bringing us into the imagination of like what is possible for our communities. What does that world look like for our communities to live in a world with dignity, with joy, with happiness, together, not separated, not broken apart, and not in terror or in fear. Next slide. And then I really wanted to uplift this project, Un Nuevo Sol, which is a documentary that, at least for CultureStrike, our approach and our strategy, whenever we're trying to disrupt cultural narratives that are hurting our community, is that we need to create those narratives that we are trying to replace, and really push the boundaries in terms of what we're thinking about working with artists. We are intentionally working with undocumented folks. Myself, I am formerly undocumented from Ecuador, and one of the things as CultureStrike is that we recognize that a lot of undocumented migrant border artists across the country are not equipped or not being given the resources to really participate in imagining and helping us push the boundaries of like the narratives that we want to do. And so Un Nuevo Sol is a documentary that follows 3 unaccompanied minors from LA, and it's such a beautiful documentary. And so for this year, we're in post-production working with Aurora Guerrero, who has been working with Julio Salgado, my colleague, and really just magnifying the incredible visions of undocumented folks and thinking about their future and thinking about the current political climate, but not from a plane of ache or not from a plane of anguish, but from a plane of imagination and literally like chasing a sun, as the title will say. Next. So I do want to conclude by saying that artists of all types are seeking a clear path some type of ladder of engagement to intervene and leverage their influence in changing narratives for migrant rights, for gender equity, racial justice, and climate solutions. And all these things are intersected. I want to lift that up as well. There's a clear demand for frameworks, leadership, field-tested approaches, and applied tools for artists to work in unity with movement groups and advocates. And so we're hoping that for those who are on the call is to join us in this process of imagining, to join us and really supporting artists and cultural workers. Our work in the cultural space, our work in storytelling is complementary to the amazing work and the policy work that is being done right now. And right now with immigration, with who we have in office right now, it's not a moment of like randomness. We actually come from a legacy of this kind of narrative, this storytelling, this anti-immigrant rhetoric and anti-immigrant terror that is happening towards our communities. Again, it's not new. But what is new is the opportunity that we have right now. And it is the right conditions right now to support artists and cultural workers across the country and to really collaborate to, I think Janelle mentioned earlier, or Julie, I believe, just how movement organizations like Mobilize the Immigrant Vote are having now like an artist in residence, and there's that appetite. And so if you would like to join us in imagining and really pushing those boundaries, this is the right moment to do that. And it's such a pleasure that I was able to do that with Janelle and with the Opportunity Agenda this past fall with the Border Visions as an example of that.
Thank you so much, Sonia. And my last question for you has to do with that partnership. From your perspective, how can advocates and organizers partner with artists to achieve some of the narrative shifts that have been discussed today? So you mentioned like an artist in residency. Could you talk about other examples of how advocates on the phone or artists on the phone could think about working together, and maybe any advice or insights and guidelines about how to make that kind of partnership successful?
Yeah, definitely. Thank you for that. So on a practical note, yes, the residencies, the allocating within your budget to see how you can collaborate with artists, or how even to bring them into like your staff meetings and your board members like meetings. And as you're going to into retreats, thinking about the programs that you're laying out or the policies that you're going to introduce, and moving beyond the transactional of experience with artists. So it's not just about like what kind of quote unquote product we can do for you, but rather like how can we have a really fueled conversation. Yeah, I think really being intentional how we want to bring artists. And so yes, the artists in residencies, but I think right now the social justice movement spaces, the organizers who are on the call, can you take the moment right now to really think about the power of arts and culture? And if you haven't, or if you're interested in, if there's the appetite for that, would love for you, like we are here, CultureStrike is here, we do this type of presentations to kind of explain out what it is to be, to use culture strategy, what it is the power of culture and art, and the incredible work that artists and cultural workers can do together. And yeah, and also, again, social justice movements must be fueled by culture in order to win. And indeed, the most radical social change is often preceded by cultural shifts. And one example is like marriage equality, for instance, was passed years after like Ellen DeGeneres helped seed the ground when she first came out on TV. And again, as our founder says, Jeff Chang says, politics and policies are where some of our people are some of the time, but culture is where most people are most of the time. And so we really emphasize, like, for the movement organizations who are on the call, for organizers and activists, come meet us halfway. Let's have a conversation about culture and culture strategy and the power of art. And we have tools. We are, happy to share that with you. It is on our CultureStrike website. They're downloadable. There's different mechanisms of really being inclusive of artists and culture workers within your space, within your visions. And we're here to collaborate and really create a potential of of partnerships with many of the artists in our network who are across the country, and many who we're trying to uplift, who are undocumented, who are queer, who are trans, who are at the intersections of many issues, because we also need an intersection of narratives that uplift many of the things that are impacting. So people are at the border, or people are dealing with immigration, are also dealing with climate change. Migrant communities are mostly impacted by also like the horrendous climate conditions that are now happening because of different companies. So yeah, I can go on, but I think the first main step is movement organizations having the appetite to really consider the power of arts and culture and artists, and from there we can look into residencies or collaborations to kind of test this out with y'all.
Thank you so much, Sonia. Now we have reached our audience Q&A section of this webinar, and we'll take questions from all of you who are listening. You can enter any questions you have into the questions function on your GoToWebinar toolbar. So check it for that toolbar. We already have some great questions. So the first question can be addressed to anyone, and it is, with border regions being so similar and so different, can you talk more about if we need to develop, one, a national border narrative, or if we need to create multiple border narratives for each border region, for example, one for the Rio Grande Valley versus one for El Paso versus San Diego? Who would like to start off with that question?
Hi, thanks, Janelle. This is Itzel. That's a great question. And I definitely think that we need to listen to the individual regions, but also listening to the whole border region narrative as a whole. And I think Southern Border Communities Coalition does a great job of doing that because we have organizations in the entire border region that are a part of this coalition, right? Listening to each other's needs, listening to each other's necessities, and then moving a narrative that fits all. But of course, each region has their own distinctive issues depending on where they are geographically located. And so it is important to listen to the individual organizations about what is happening in their individual regions, but also listening to the whole narrative as a whole.
Thanks.
Yeah.
I also want to invite Julie. Yeah, great. I know the opportunity walks that walk. So Julie, you want to comment on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'll hit it right on. It's always a mixture. I mean, I think it always depends on the story, the medium, right, and the opportunity and the audience that you're talking to. But we definitely, want to share the specific challenges and realities of the various communities. But when we're talking to audiences who are less familiar and who are sitting in the interior, not really understanding what's going on, we want to make sure that we're giving them a story that they can latch on to, which is going to be a unified narrative about the fact, that these are communities that deserve a say and things that affect them, that the border region is filled with communities and people who have history and culture and, and don't want the same things that we don't want in our communities, which is drones and checkpoints and militarization and all of that. So we need to have like a big story. Then, as Itzel said, we can draw smaller stories for examples that really do show the specific things that each area and community are facing.
And just to piggyback on some of the things that are already being shared, I think there's never enough stories and never enough narratives that can be coming out from a region. And so I think that just personalizing those narratives are super helpful. So my experience, even if living in New York City, and there's other artists from New York City, we will have moved through that, through the physical space in different ways, as gender nonconforming, as trans, as undocumented, as Black, as Muslim. And so if we can uplift those kind of narratives, it only helps us really have a well-rounded understanding of what is happening at the border and what is the world that we're trying to build. So I think that many more narratives that we can push out from the different parts of the regions, the better it is for us to really push the imagination and really center the kind of immigrant justice that we're looking for our communities. And so, yeah, if we can have definitely a national strategy, a national framework, and at the same time, uplifting the different sectors and different communities even within those regions, and making sure that even within those marginalized communities, we're uplifting folks' voices of families who are facing deportation, or families who are dealing with all sorts of issues. And so I think that the many more narratives, the more holistic and understanding that we can have, and the better that we are able to change people's hearts and minds.
Thanks. I have a question about reaching folks outside of the border region. So we've talked a lot about the different folks that we've worked with within the border region to be able to uplift those voices and really focus on some of those stories. But how do you reach folks who don't have such connections to the border region, especially since the debate is really centering around the border region without actually including those border region voices? What ways would you recommend reaching those persuadable audiences in different places that may only be getting their border framework from the news?
I can start. This is Julie. I mean, I think one of the most important things is to, familiarize the story. As you said, talk about things like, history, shared history, food traditions, even sports teams, things that we all have in our communities, and how, just to make it clear that these are communities like other communities that face, a lot of unique issues that we in our own communities would not want to face. So we all have a shared responsibility to make sure that everybody is, living in a community where they're experiencing safety, where they're being treated, with dignity and respect by law enforcement, where they have freedom to move around, all of the things that we all want. And so I think there's a bit of universalism that can go there just to start off, before then moving into the unique stories and the unique narratives for folks who are, just kind of dipping their toe in the story and don't know that much about it. I think the second thing is that it's really up to everybody in the migrant rights movement, to take this up. In years past, we've seen border security become kind of a political, strategy that people could use. Like, of course, we want to secure the border, and that kind of language just is not helpful for this larger story. And so I think we all need to take responsibility for this narrative, and really think about how we're talking about it, so that those uninitiated audiences are not just hearing border security over and over again, even from us, right? So I feel like we need to be telling the full story as much as we can, even if we can just find short ways to do it. I know a lot of us are talking about many different issues, not just the border region, but when we are talking about the border region, have like 2 sentences that you can say first that further the right narrative, and then move into your smaller, your other arguments or your more political arguments, but always trying to be building that story, so that the folks who are talking about it in other contexts for longer conversations have that to work with at least, and aren't just constantly up against border security, wall.
Hi, everyone. This is Itzel. Just to piggyback off of Julie, using the Dreamer example, United We Dream has been doing an amazing job of using this border narrative. And initially, this wasn't the case. As a national movement, the border region was missed. And so now, moving forward, we are truly grateful to United We Dream that touches the whole entire country for this Dreamer solution, right? A DACA deal that doesn't include further enforcement for border communities. And that's really important, because 1 in 5 of us live in the border region. That's about 20% of us here, right? So that's a huge number that we have to consider, just using that example.
Great, thank you. The next question, I think, is also for everyone. When aiming to shift the narrative, can you discuss the different audiences that you aim to target? Like, folks who are already your allies, folks who might be your allies but maybe are uninitiated in some of the issues, opponents, and how different narratives and tactics, particularly and cultural strategies, might be used for different audiences. And I'm going to invite maybe Sonia, do you want to start with answering this question?
Yes, definitely. I think first and foremost, when we're thinking about different audiences, I do want to uplift that even our communities are in need, have a big appetite and hunger to hear narratives that are encompassing all of our identities and like are uplifting our communities in a place from, like, again, from a place of joy that is really imagining how our families can be together. And so I think that there's something about like centering and uplifting audiences from even within our communities to make sure that we're creating content, we're creating narratives, storytelling, storylines, movies, documentaries, art that is really centering our communities and is for our communities. Simultaneously, there is larger audiences who are our opponents, who are comrades, who are allies, who are maybe working on many social justice issues, or maybe are not well-versed in immigrant rights. They may be working on like climate change and may not know what's happening at the border, or well-versed in like detention centers. And so I think that there's that opportunity. And so, yeah, engaging with different narratives, I think for me is, what kind of narratives are we working with, and really sitting down with your team and with your organization and seeing who you want to reach. And they require different methods, different mediums. And again, I can't stress how artists and storytellers move people intellectually, emotionally. And so just figuring out what kind of resources you have, what is the grasp of that, and really, what is a priority for your organization? Do you have the bandwidth to have all the audiences in mind, or is there a specific group of folks that you're trying to influence? And so, again, pairing up with the right type of artist, whether it's a poet, whether it's a visual artist or filmmaker, will help you really strategize the type of audience that you're going for. And also, again, what is like ultimately your goal around the type of narratives you're trying to push? Is it for a policy? Is it for community empowerment? Yeah, so I just wanted to stress that there's so many different approaches and strategies in going for different narratives. And at least for us, we're always centering the voice and the agency of the artists and cultural workers to see how and where they want their art to land and the stories that they want to tell, where it wants to land. And I think for us on Nuevo Sol, that's a documentary that is specifically uplifting 3 unaccompanied minors, and one of their specific audience definitely was for fellow undocumented folks to see themselves on the screen, to really be uplifted in they themselves sharing their own narratives. And so that's one approach. And then for us, there's also a larger audience of folks who may not be looking and reading policy papers, or may not be, at a press conference, who are most Americans who may not be engaged in a particular way in immigrant rights, that they can turn and see a documentary and really be moved, like their hearts and their minds be moved by the stories of these 3 unaccompanied minors from LA.
Thank you. Itzel, do you have any thoughts on the different narratives or tactics you use for your different audiences?
Thank you. I think Sonia hit it right. Using different creative mediums is definitely one of the best ways to reach large audiences that would not necessarily be touched by, let's say, an op-ed or a media interview. And so I think that it's truly important to have artists, listen and work with advocates that are here from the border region to produce material that will touch individuals at a different level. And, using the migration is beautiful, the butterfly as a symbol of all of this movement, I think is amazing. And it touches individuals that may have not necessarily thought about butterflies as being used for migration, but it creates a whole new environment of artistry that produces more conversation about what migration really means and what it means not only for people, but for wildlife and our environment as well.
And Julie, I know that the Opportunity Agenda has done a lot of work around analyzing different audiences and trying to figure out how to target. Can you speak a little bit about best practices around the kinds of narratives or tactics that we think about when we're looking at different audiences?
Sure. I mean, one of the ways that we have typically approached this is very much through the communications lens, as opposed to the cultural lens, not that they're completely separate, but when we work with folks who are working a little bit more specifically on advocacy issues, we often recommend that you look at audience from a scale from 1 to 5, being the ones being the kind of already convinced folks who just need to be energized and given the right tools to go out and spread the message, to 5s who are never going to really be with us, the opposition, if you will, and then kind of segment in between with the 2s and 3s being kind of the persuadables and 4s being the harder persuadables, and really think about who is in each of those groups and what they are responding to. Most importantly, what values we share with them. And that can be pretty easy with the 1s through 3s. It can stretch when we get to the 4s, like, do we actually share values? But typically, if you peel it back, we find that there are, things to work with, and there are ways to reach that both heart and mind piece that is so important in, changing the way that they support policies and the way that they even vote in some instances. So, just really thinking what did each of these groups look like? What media do they consume? Who do they trust? How can we reach them? And also, as Sonia said, who do we have the bandwidth to reach? Because it's true that we don't need to reach everybody. We don't need to reach the 5s. We're not going to change their minds. They're not going to change our minds. So how can we use our limited resources to reach the groups that maybe our group already has the best access to, and then have an ally strategy for trying to get to groups that are a little bit harder. And also just thinking, who do we actually need to move what we're trying to move today? So, that's one of the tools that we give folks to think through. And I want to just say on top of that isn't a ideological spectrum. It's not a partisan spectrum. We're not saying that 1s are Democrats and 5s are Republicans, because that's not true. That is just a tool to lay down onto whatever issue to take a look at, okay, who is really with us and who is against us and who maybe just doesn't understand enough. And I think there's a lot of folks, particularly who are more in the interior part of the country, who really fall into that, don't really understand enough to have fully formed opinions about the border region. So we can really take a look at some of those 3s and think, what are the stories that would move them? What are the messages? What is this kind of storytelling? And, how do we have access to them? And if we don't have access to them, who of our partners do that we could work with?
Thank you. And we're going to end the Q&A section there. And I just want to offer a big thanks to Julie, Sonia, and Itzel for sharing all of your knowledge with us today. If any of you listeners have any questions about today's material, please feel free to reach out to me, Janelle Tribitz, or Elizabeth Johnson. We're also sending you a link with this recording as a follow-up, and we will post the recording on our website tomorrow, so you can share that with any colleagues who couldn't make it today. As you close out of GoToWebinar, a short evaluation will pop up, and please fill that out so we can make sure we're offering the best possible content to partners in the future. Thank you all so much for being here with us, and have a great day.